Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is August 27th, 2024, and tonight we'll be doing a class on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This class tonight will be focusing on the history leading up to it. We'll examine the pact itself, and then we'll be looking at some of the authors that have published all about the lies about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and what it was really trying to do and what Stalin was trying to do at the time. And with that, as well, tonight we will be pulling from Unveiling the Lies of the Cold War by Ekaterina Blinova, as well as what the literature that Grover Furr has wrote on this topic. So our first section will be the background and lead up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And comrade, you have the floor.
Oh, I think first there's a clip from Mission to Moscow.
Tarish Krasinski, I think we have done remarkably well.
I was very surprised to see you here, Herr von Ribbentrop. I had no idea you were in Moscow.
A matter of business, Lady Chilston, but I miss London very much.
Herr von Ribbentrop is very partial to the English.
Indeed. Well, now, let's not argue about it.
Well, America builds the best transport planes in the world.
That's true. I've converted many of your Douglas transport into bombers.
I know.
My friend, you better forget about commercial aviation and concentrate on warplanes.
You Russians are always hearing the drums of war.
Italian olives, Mr. Molotov?
Spanish. We in Russia have learned to judge our neighbors by what they do, and not by what their representatives say. And what is happening in the world today? Not a very pleasant prospect, Mr. Davies. One nation has already invaded another without provocation or excuse, and contrary to its legal obligations. Still another aggressor is attempting to overthrow the legal government of its neighbor by sending men and equipment to support a revolt. The little nations tremble, trying to walk the tightrope between the great powers. Their only defense is their utter helplessness. But whom can they trust? On whom can they depend? It's the devil's gamble. So they smile on everyone and hope for the best. The weaker the country, the stronger the smile. But what about the great powers who could oppose aggression? Instead of standing together, they make deals with the enemy. They even found a lovely new word for it. They call it appeasement. That is what I've had to contend with, my friend. And that is not the whole story, Mr. Davies. Not all our enemies are outside Russia. They also have their agents in our midst, trying to create havoc and distrust.
Traitors, your own people?
Mr. Davies, you will recall the proud statement made recently by a fascist general. We have 4 columns in front of Madrid, and a 5th inside the city.
5th column. It's hard for most Americans to realize these things with 2 great oceans between us and our possible enemies.
I wouldn't rely too much on isolation, my friend. Oceans are not as wide as they used to be. Yes, Krasinski?
I beg your pardon. May I speak to you a moment?
These clips are from Mission to Moscow. We do recommend searching for the whole movie on YouTube. It's a fantastic movie. And the first one was about the American ambassador talking with Molotov and the other Russian officials about the situation. And then the second one is during the Moscow trial sections where Bukharin admits that the Trotskyite, Bukharinist, Zinovieite bloc would have opened Ukraine to German expansion if Trotsky and his goons were put into power.
Collective security. The appointment of Hitler as Germany's Chancellor General, as well as the rising threat from Japan, led to important changes in Soviet foreign policy, oriented toward Germany since the Treaty of Locarno in 1925 and the Treaty of Special Relations with Berlin in 1926. The Kremlin now moved in the opposite direction by trying to establish closer ties with France and Britain to isolate the growing Nazi threat. This policy became known as collective security and was associated with Maxim Litvinov, the Soviet foreign minister at the time. The pursuit of collective security lasted approximately as long as he held that position. Japan's war with China took some pressure off of Russia by allowing it to focus its diplomatic efforts on relations with Europe. That's a quote from Russia and the West from Alexander to Putin. So here's a list of the Munich Accords and other treaties with Nazi Germany. The Reichskonkordat, July 20th, 1933, between Germany and the Vatican. The German-Polish Declaration of Non-Aggression, January 26, 1934. Juliet Commune, the July Agreement, February 11, 1936. Austria and Germany. Later, UNCLOS on March 13, 1938. The Anti-Comintern Pact, November 25th, 1936, between Germany, Japan, Italy, Hungary, Manchukuo, Spain. The Munich Agreement, which was September 30th, 1938, between France, Italy, UK, and Germany. The German-Romanian Treaty for the Development of Economic Relations between the two countries in 1939. The German-Latvian Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, and the German-Estonian Non-Aggression Pact, also in 1939. And here's an image with Chamberlain in the center with the hat and umbrella in his hands, with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop on the right, as the Prime Minister leaves for home after the Berchtesgaden meeting in September of 1938. And on the left is Alex von Dornberg. And here's a diagram of the partition of Czechoslovakia. According to the Munich Accords, yes, the Munich Accords and other treaties with Nazi Germany continued. So papers which were kept secret for almost 70 years show that the USSR proposed sending a powerful military force in an effort to entice Britain and France into an anti-Nazi alliance. Such an agreement could have changed the course of 20th century history. The offer of a military force to help contain Hitler was made by a senior Soviet military delegation at a Kremlin meeting with senior British and French officers 2 weeks before war broke out in 1939. The new documents show the vast numbers of infantry, artillery, and airborne forces which Stalin's generals said could be dispatched if Polish objections to the Red Army crossing its territory could first be overcome. But the British and French side, briefed by their governments to talk, but not authorized to commit to binding deals, did not respond to the Soviet offer.
Thank you, comrade. And with that, we will break for our first discussion round. And if you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand function and we will get to you in the order they go up. Just a quick note, some of the treaties that were mentioned, all of those were signed before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, especially the first one, which was the Reichskonkordant, was between Germany and the Vatican on basically agreements of how German priests should operate, but it was pretty much violated by the Nazis as soon as it came into effect. And that one is actually still in effect to this day, I believe. But Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, just to remind people, I hope everybody could hear me loud and clear.
Go ahead.
The League of Nations, after World War I, they set up the League of Nations. That was supposed to be a way for countries to come together and discuss their differences. At the League of Nations meeting, the Soviet representative to the League of Nations was Maxim Livanov. And at that meeting, he called, Italy had invaded Ethiopia. I want to get everybody's mindset of what we're talking about. Italy had invaded Ethiopia, and the Soviet representative Maxim Livanov said, we need collective security. He wasn't even talking about Germany. He was talking about Italy. We need collective security. And so that was, when was that Italy invaded Ethiopia? I don't remember the year. But from that time all the way up until 39, it could have been 10 years. It could have been 10 or more years. I don't know the date.
60 seconds.
Off the top of my head. Does anybody know?
1935.
Okay. So from 35 to 39, 4 years, the Soviets were telling the West, we need collective security to stop what the Italians and the Germans were going to be doing. And for 4 years, they did nothing. Finally, the Stalin had met the American ambassador, Maxine Davies, and told him at a meeting, and in the movie it shows you that, which we couldn't see today. But in the movie it shows you that Stalin tells him, If you don't have a collective security with us to stop what's going on in Germany and Italy, then we're going to sign a non-aggression pact with Germany. This was all told to the American ambassador. This is nothing secret about this. I want people to know that. So they were forced, the Soviets were forced to sign a non-aggression pact. Otherwise, they would have been the closest for Germany to invade. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. Comrade Andrea, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, who's the biggest voice today, maybe apart from learning it in high school, who still lies about the Ribbentrop Pact, saying it was an alliance? Does anyone know if there's any major like U.S. groups, or is it just something we're told in high school? Thank you.
I would say probably for sure the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation would definitely spread that one around. And then you've probably got some NGO groups connected with the Ukraine government and some others, I'm sure, that are the major ones, but in academia as well, it's still, even though there has been Westernly scholarly work that has dismissed it, it's still kind of a don't dare question this thing. Comrade Angelo, do you have a response?
It's called, they teach it in school, it's called the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which is not the name of it. It's called German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. That's the correct name. And they deliberately teach it in the schools as the Stalin-Hitler Pact. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. There we go.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up just the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is like brought up like a lot of times, but even like by other like communists like Trotskyists or whoever, as a gotcha against AMLs that like, oh, see, the Soviet Union was working with the Nazis, they didn't really care, and it's like, yeah, you're really oversimplifying that. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Comrade. Can bring that up to some of the Trotskyists. I know they will then say, well, that was Grover Furr's writing. Grover Furr's not a real academic. I'm like, I didn't mention Grover Furr.
Yeah. So mentioned something really great about the victims of communism propaganda within America. There's a statue in the Capitol and of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., and just literally one block away is who the city is named after. Well, it's named after Washington, of course, George Washington, but also Christopher Columbus, Columbia. Those statues are within like eye shot of each other. And to think of the pact that Germany and the Soviet Union had created, that was rapid settler colonialism. So within the American system, those two things are interlinked. Within the global system, they're literally a block away from each other.
Thank you, Comrade. So this was actually a Telegraph article from about, I think it was about 2012, where basically the UK military declassified documents around this. And they were like, oh, yeah, the Soviets offered to send 1 million troops to contain Hitler before the war broke out. And we ignored that. Yeah, but Stalin's bad, basically.
Well, was that in Poland or Czechoslovakia?
They were going to send the troops to the border of, because they had to move them through Poland, but they were going to move them to the border of Czechoslovakia. But of course, Poland, being at the time very anti-communist with the bourgeois government there, refused the Soviets' passage across the Polish territory.
Thank you. Yeah. And speaking of, Grover Furr, Grover Furr has an absolutely fantastic essay that he wrote, a really good document about Trotskyite collaboration with the Germans and also the Imperial Japanese. The deal that was brokered between Trotsky's faction, him and Bukharin, and also the fascists, specifically when it came to the Imperial Japanese Army, the deal that was brokered was that if the coup succeeded against Stalin in the USSR, that Japan would get oil rights in Siberia. And that was critical. That whole situation was critical in prosecuting Bukharin and also exiling Trotsky during
60
during
seconds.
the Moscow trials. Also, from the very get-go, I mean, like even before the militarist sentiment was growing in Japan, the Japanese government was very vehemently opposed to communism and the spread of communism. So the very first thing that they noticed after the Bolshevik Revolution was that it would deeply affect their Manchu-Mongol policies.
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I know we were talking about the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, and they're also, big in Canada, maybe even bigger. There's a lot of like descendants of former Nazis and Nazis who fled to Canada after the war who are there. They do events, they're involved in politics, and they actually just invited a former SS soldier to speak in Canadian Parliament. And then they had to, of course, apologize shortly after that when they kind of, I guess, realized what they had done. But I mean, they're very active still. So just interesting.
I remember when that happened. God, that was a time.
Wasn't that last year when that happened? Yeah. And just to piggyback off of what Comrade was saying, it was 1931 when Japan attacked China, and they went all the way up to the Soviet border in Siberia. So there was a possibility that the Soviet Union, or at least they felt that they would be at war with imperialist Japan. So it's just something to consider as well. That's all.
Correct. And in I believe the mid-30s, they had fought a series of border skirmishes with the Japanese Kwantung Army. So
I wanted to mention some background to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well, like what Comrade was mentioning. You had the Soviet Union facing a possibility of a multi-front war where they would have to worry about the Japanese to the east, who they did fight skirmishes with alongside the Mongolian People's Republic, and possible from the west as well against the Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, and so on and so forth. The policy that they were trying to pursue was primarily trying to minimize the amount of fronts that they were fighting, to minimize to maximize the concentration of forces that they can muster to whatever front that they needed to fight on. So they would pursue a non-aggressive pact with the imperialist Japan, who basically said, "Well, turn our backs to each other, not mess with each other throughout the war," which made the Nazis angry, obviously. But you also had the fact that throughout the lead up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, constant betrayals by the capitalist powers seeking to contain the Bolshevik Revolution, that they allowed fascist Italy to attack Ethiopia on the grounds of, quote unquote, liberating the slaves, where they used poison gas on the Ethiopian people there. It's quite literally a terrifying thing to think about. And they pretty much spent
90 seconds.
Time letting the fascists run wild up until the point that the had the fascists turn heel upon them with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and they started marching on at Paris instead. That's all.
Thank you, comrade. We'll take one more hand and then we'll need to go on. Comrade, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to pick he said and give a quick announcement to the Outlook publishers. Then about the next month, we'll have a book out from the Outlook publishers that documents these from of the Ukrainians called Lest We Forget. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you, comrades. Okay, we will now continue on with our presentation. So section 2 is going to be on the pact itself, and that is going to be, comrade, have the floor.
All right. Thank you. The pact itself. The government of the German Reich and the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, desirous of strengthening the cause of peace between Germany and the USSR, and proceeding from the fundamental provisions of the Neutrality Agreement concluded in April 1926 between Germany and the USSR, have reached the following agreement. Article 1. Both high contracting parties obligate themselves to desist from any act of violence, any aggressive action, and any attack on each other, either individually or jointly with other powers. Article 2. Should one of the high contracting parties become the object of belligerent action by a third power, the other high contracting party shall in no manner lend its support to this third power. Article 3. The governments of the two high contracting parties shall in the future maintain continual contact with one another for the purpose of consultation in order to exchange information on problems affecting their common interests. Article 4. Should disputes or conflicts arise between the high contracting parties, shall participate in any grouping of powers whatsoever that is directly or indirectly aimed at the other party. Article 5. Should disputes or conflicts arise between the high contracting parties over problems of one kind or another, both parties shall settle these disputes or conflicts exclusively through friendly exchange of opinion, or if necessary, through the establishment of arbitration commissions. Article 6. The present treaty is concluded for a period of 10 years, with a proviso that insofar as one of the high contracting parties does not advance it 1 year prior to the expiration of this period, the validity of this treaty shall automatically be extended for another 5 years. Article 7. The present treaty shall be ratified within the shortest possible time. The ratification shall be exchanged in Berlin. The agreement shall enter into force as soon as it is signed. Pact, Additional Secret Protocol. This section not published when the pact was announced. Article 1. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement in the areas belonging to the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the northern boundary of Lithuania shall represent the boundary of the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR. In this connection, the interest of Lithuania in the Vilna area is recognized by each party. Article 2. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the line of the rivers Narev, Vistula, and San. The question of whether the interests of both parties make desirable the maintenance of an independent Polish state and how such a state should be bounded can only be definitively determined in the course of further political developments. In any event, both governments will resolve this question by means of a friendly agreement. Article 3. With regard to southeastern Europe, attention is called by the Soviet side to its interest in Bessarabia. The German side declares its complete political disinterestedness in these areas. Article 4. This protocol shall be treated by both parties as strictly secret. All right, so there was a planned division of Central Europe according to Molotov-Ribbentrop, defining Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. All right, and it's showing in 40 that Soviet Union would be annexing Poland. Oh, and all four of them as their sphere of influence. And Germany would do Lithuania, and basically Poland is divided in half. So there you go. And the actual territorial changes. Yeah.
Thank you, comrade. We'll now stop for another discussion round. If you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function. If you remember back to that map, actually the dividing line for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would have cut directly through Warsaw. And though with the Germans having Lithuania and the Vilnius area, they would have been approximately 200 or so kilometers closer to Moscow, as well as St. Petersburg. So had the actual full provision and sphere of influence section had been followed through, the Germans very well could have marched onto Leningrad and Moscow. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Okay, very important. There is a misconception among many people here and in the general public, and that's the phrase sphere of influence. It does not mean a division of a territory. I want to make that clear. The Yalta agreements in World War II, the Yalta agreements between the four great powers, France, England, United States, and the Soviet Union. They set up in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe the sphere of influences. That did not mean that the United States was going to take over a country, or France or the Soviet Union was going to take over a country. It only means that their interest is in a neighboring country that's near them, very close to them. That's what sphere of influence means. It does not mean division. I want to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. In fact, Bessarabia, very shortly after the Great Patriotic War, became the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. The areas that Poland had taken during the 1920s of both Belarusia and Ukraine were returned to those SSRs, and Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia became their own independent SSRs as well. There was another SSR independent called the Karelia Finnish SSR, but I believe in the 1950s constitution that was remade into a autonomous of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic.
Yeah, I was going to say the map of the division is, or, looking at the historical maps altogether, is a key thing that truly does, diffuse and defeat the entire accusations of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact being some kind of a secret plot to divide Poland. Because you quite literally look at Poland today. Poland, you see on the map right there, has its central part there with Warsaw, Danzig, and all the other places in the Cyan. Those are Poland still, but after the war, they were also gifted, I believe, I forget, Saxony and another part of the German side to dismantle Prussia willingly, I might add, from the East German GDR to give Poland a proper land that was nominally a mixed place, but, restored Poland proper. The yellow lands themselves were taken from the Soviet Union, well, the Russian RSF during the Civil War, specifically during the fight between the breakaway Polish Republic and the Russian communists during the fight in the Civil War. The key thing there is that they took not just Poland itself, but also southeast, Western Belarus and Western Ukraine as a part of the peace agreement. So it more or less was just a reuniting of stolen lands.
Thank you, Comrade Andre. You have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I'm going to state a few things that I know, and then I can be corrected. So World War II began when Germany invaded Poland, which implies that before that, Germany was not in Poland. So like Comrade Angelo said, those colors are representing spheres of influence. They didn't physically meet in Warsaw and divide the country in half. Am I correct?
Correct. That is correct.
Correct. And to go back to Comrade comment, Saxony was where present-day Dresden is in Germany. I believe it was Silesia and Upper Salzburg, which kind of formed that triangle shape that jutted out in eastern Germany that went to Poland, the Polish People's Republic. And then part of the Königsberg area, part of that went to Poland, and then the other part of it, including the city of Königsberg, became a part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic and is present-day Kaliningrad. All right. Any other questions or comments before we move on?
Yes, Angela wants to mention the area that we're talking about on the coast, the Baltic Sea, on the ocean, that Poland got. They renamed it the city of Gansk. It used to be called Danzig, the German name, but when the Polish People's Republic took it, it became Gansk. It was the big shipyards there, the Lenin shipyards that produced all the big ships for Poland, the Soviet Union, and everything else. That was where the Solidarity Anti-Communist Union started, in that city of Gansk, and it was led by Lee Walenska. But that's a very historical point that should be mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also believe as well, Gdansk was, it's also called the Free City at some point in the 20s. I'm not sure if it was under an international mandate or a joint thing as well. I'd have to look into that, but that's kind of outside the scope of this class. If there's no other hands or comments, we'll move on to some of the literature. We'll be reading from Grover Furr and also from Unveiling Lies of the Cold War by Ekaterina Blinova for our last section, but we'll have 2 readers for that. So our first section is going to be on Grover Furr.
All right, so this is from Grover Furr's book, Stalin, Waiting for the Truth. So Kotkin's omissions and falsifications about September 1939, and that's Stephen Kotkin, who his book was a rebuttal to Stephen Kotkin's book about Stalin. September 1939, the Soviet seizure of Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia from Poland. There was no Soviet declaration of war. Potyomkin summoned Polish ambassador Grzybowski at 3:15 a.m. and read aloud a note in the name of Molotov, unilaterally abrogating the Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Pact. The envoy refused to take the document. On the radio, Molotov announced a Soviet military action supposedly necessitated by the disappearance of the Polish state and the possible ensuing chaos. The Soviet government regards as its sacred duty to proffer help to its Ukrainian and Belarusian brothers in Poland, he stated. In fact, the Polish government continued to function, having relocated to Kuty in the southeast on the Polish side with Romania. And then it says, the sentences above in boldface are misleading because Kotkin conceals from his readers many crucial facts. Here are some of them. And here are some of those. 1, there was no declaration of war because the USSR was not at war with Poland. The myth of the, quote, joint invasion is a fabrication by the anti-communist Polish government in exile. It was rejected by the Allies at the same time, but picked up once the Cold War began in the 1940s. All the Western Allies recognized Soviet neutrality. Winston Churchill strongly supported the Soviet incursion into eastern Poland. In his radio speech of October 1st, 1939, printed in the New York Times on October 2nd, 1939, page 6, Churchill, at the time First Lord of the Admiralty, said, "Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. We could have wished that the Russian armies should be standing on their present line as the friends and allies of Poland, but that the Russian armies should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace." And that on the right side, that is the cover art for Stephen Kotkin's book that Grover Furr wrote the rebuttal to. And more on Kotkin's omissions. Churchill also agreed that it was in the interest of the Allies to have the Red Army occupying these territories. Here, these interests of Russia fall into the same channel as the interests of Britain and France. 2. The Polish state had indeed ceased to function. Neither the Polish army nor Ambassador Grzybowski was able to contact it. Grzybowski did not even know where it was. 3. Later the same day, September 17th, 1939, the Polish government crossed the border into Romania, where it was interned and was no longer a government. 4. The Germans had told the Soviets that if they did not intervene, a pro-fascist Ukrainian state would be formed next to the Soviet border. Number 5. No treaty was broken since a, quote, fundamental change in circumstances had occurred. And then in Latin, talking about the point of, at this point of affairs in these circumstances, a tacit condition attached to all treaties to the effect that they will no longer be binding as soon as the state of facts and conditions upon which they were based changes to a substantial degree. And then the next one is in public international law, clausula rebus sic stantibus, Latin for things thus standing, is the legal doctrine allowing for treaties to become inapplicable because of a fundamental change of circumstances. And it is essentially an escape clause that makes an exception to the general rule of pacta sunt servanda, which is promises must be kept. The Polish government had lost contact with its ambassadors to the Soviet Union and with the Polish army, which was in the process of fleeing to internment in Romania. Some parts interned themselves in the Baltic states. The German army would have come up to the Soviet border if the Red Army had not intervened. Kotkin hides from his readers that during the 1950s, American professor George Ginsburg's published 2 articles that vindicate the Soviet position. Ginsburg's concluded, for all these various reasons, it may safely be concluded that on this particular point, the Soviet argument was successful, and that the, quote, above considerations do not allow for any doubt that there did not exist a state of war between Poland and the USSR in September 1939. In spite of scattered protests to the contrary, the consensus heavily sides with the Soviet view that by September 17, 1939, the Polish government was in panic and full flight, that it did not exercise any appreciable control over its armed forces or its remaining territory, and that the days of Poland were indeed numbered. De facto, then, one may well accept the view that the Polish government no longer functioned as an effective state power. In such a case, the Soviet claim that Eastern Galicia was in fact a terra nullius may not be unjustified and could be sustained. And then a point from Grover Furr's book, Blood Lies. And this is a point on the Soviet Union was not an aggressor. The USSR did not invade Poland, and everybody knew it at the time. When Poland had no government, Poland was no longer a state. That meant that Hitler had nobody with whom to negotiate a ceasefire or treaty. Furthermore, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty's secret protocols were void, since they were in agreement with the state of Poland, but no state of Poland existed any longer. Unless the Red Army came in to prevent it, there was nothing to prevent the Nazis from coming right up to the Soviet border. Or, as we now know, they were in fact preparing to do. Hitler could have formed one or more pro-Nazi states in what had until recently been Eastern Poland. That way, Hitler could have had it both ways. He could claim to the Soviets that he was still adhering to the, quote, spheres of influence agreement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, while in fact setting up a pro-Nazi, highly militarized, fascist Ukrainian nationalist state on the Soviet border. And more from Blood Lies. Once the Germans had told the Soviets that they, the German leadership, had decided that the Polish state no longer existed, then it did not make any difference whether the Soviets or some hypothetical body of international jurists agreed with them or not. In effect, the Nazis were telling the Soviets that they felt free to come right up to the Soviet border. Neither the USSR nor any state could have permitted such a thing, nor did international law demand it. At the end of September, a new secret agreement was concluded. In it, the Soviet line of interest was to the east of the, quote, sphere of influence line decided upon. A month earlier in the secret protocol and published in Izvestia and in the New York Times during September 1939. In this territory, Poles were a minority, even after the Polonization, which equals to making more Polish, campaign of settling Poles in the area during the 20s and 30s.
All right, thank you. And then for our final reading section, I will have General Secretary Comrade Joe read this part. You have the floor, sir.
From Ekaterina Belikova, Unveiling the Lies of the Cold War. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, inked by the USSR and Nazi Germany on August 23, 1939, is now used by Western quote-unquote experts and mainstream media to accuse the Soviet Union of colluding with Hitler and betraying his would-be French and British allies, but evidence suggests otherwise. On August 23, 1939, the USSR and Nazi Germany signed a Treaty of Non-Aggression, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The document still triggers fierce debate, prompting the West to accuse the USSR of colluding with Hitler on the eve of the Second World War. Curiously enough, Western experts and mass media remained silent about the fact that most major European powers had signed similar treaties with Adolf Hitler earlier than the Soviet Union did. While pointing the finger at the USSR for moving into territories of Poland when no state of Poland existed any longer after German invasion of September 1st, 1939, some Western historians are again demonstrating a peculiar form of amnesia, apparently forgetting that these very territories, Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, were annexed by Poland during the Polish-Soviet War from 1919 to 1921. The war was unilaterally unleashed by Warsaw against the USSR, torn and devastated by the Civil War. In general, the USSR returned its own territories, with the exception of the small piece of Bukovina that were grabbed by other European players during the chaos of the Revolution of 1917. And there's a quote, "Until 1939, Poland did all it could to sabotage Soviet efforts to build an anti-Nazi alliance based on the World War I anti-German coalition of France, Britain, and Italy, and in 1917, the United States. In 1934 to 1935, when the USSR sought a mutual assistance pact with France, Poland attempted to obstruct it," Carly emphasized. Why is the West demonizing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? According to Andrei Fursov, in Munich, the four powers created a, quote, proto-NATO bloc that was actually aimed against the USSR. Czechoslovakia's industrial complex was meant to facilitate the growth of the German military might and ensure its ability to launch a big war against the quote-unquote Bolsheviks in the East, in order to extend the German Lebensraum. And European elites were interested in this war, expected to exhaust both Germany and Russia. In light of this, the only move to undermine this plan and postpone its realization was to conclude a similar non-aggression pact between the USSR and Germany. Furthermore, the delay helped the Soviet Union to accumulate its resources in the face of an inevitable invasion from the West. Michael Jabara Carly cited Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who said on October 1st, 1939, in an interview to the British national broadcaster, that Soviet action, quote, was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace, unquote. That was Winston Churchill saying that. Why then is the West making every effort to demonize the Soviet-German non-aggression treaty, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Professor Carley noted that it is a vain attempt to whitewash Europe's grave mistakes of the 1930s, namely the incapability or unwillingness to halt the rise of Nazi Germany and to establish an anti-Hitler alliance in the early 1930s. Quote, these days, Western governments and their inspired journalists, if one can call them journalists, don't worry about tendentious arguments when it comes to blackening the Russian Federation. It's anything goes. Should we let them equate the roles of the USSR and Nazi Germany for starting World War II? Certainly not. It was Hitler who intended war, and the French and British, especially the British, who repeatedly played into his hands, rejecting Soviet proposals for collective security and pressuring France to do the same. Again, that's Professor Carley.
Thank you, General Secretary Joe. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
I want to mention to everyone, there's a lot of similarities between Poland, Finland, and Ukraine. Both were called Finland and Poland during that period of time were called democracies. They weren't. Poland was led by a nationalist who was a fascist. His name was General Pilsudski, Pilsudksi, I believe it is. General Pilsudski was a German Nazi. He was a Polish Nazi. All right. And that was what happened. Finland was led by a German-oriented general named Monahan.
60 seconds.
Monahan, if I pronounce it correctly. And Ukraine today is led by a pro-German element. That's the government in Kiev is pro-German. That's why Germany gave them all these military equipment recently. So the West tries to say that they are democracies that are attacked by authoritarian systems, either Putin's Russia or Stalin's government. I just wanted to point it out that none of them were democracies. They were all their own authoritarian states. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. I would like to put a special mention out to Hungary as well, who was ruled by a military general at the time, General Horthy. He was an enormous fascist supporter, and in fact, Hungary carved up parts of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland, and were some of the biggest contributors to the Nazi war effort as well, even though Horthy claimed he was neutral. But Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I probably want to also bounce off of what Comrade Angelo said, and also go in to say that in the liberated Poland areas, after the Soviet troops rolled in and started basically setting up infrastructure and connections to the local people, within the couple of years that they were there, before the war broke out, they actually started instituting Soviet democracy into all of the villages that they were at, both in the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and even some of the Polish areas that they had. They started building up connections to the local people, building local councils, and trying to introduce democratic elements in the areas that they were, quote, occupying. So this is something that we can see compared to occupying forces of our day versus the work that was done back then. Hey, shit. You could even see the work that was done on the Nazi side and compare to the Soviet side and say the actions that the Soviet soldiers took into the eastern side of Poland does not compare to what the actions that has been perpetrated by the Nazis and has been perpetrated by other capitalist and imperialist forces in all the wars of conquest that they've waged throughout history. That's all.
Thank you, Comrade. As a matter of fact, going off of that, so the Germans got as far as the city of Brzezew, or what is Brest-Litovsk, now part of the very western city of Belarusia. The Red Army had the German army got there, and then a week later the Red Army came. The Germans had wanted to do a dual parade in the city, but the Red Army at that point had just gotten there and were tired and not as spick and shiny as the Nazis were. So, when the Nazis pulled out, the Red Army actually prevented all the trucks that had been loaded up with loot from the city from actually leaving. So, funnily enough.
Yeah, it was Admiral Horthy, and what else was I gonna say? Something else I've see here, and so it's good. Oh yes, and Poland also took pieces of Czechoslovakia after the partition of Czechoslovakia.
And I can't remember which one of these materials it was that talked about how, like we saw, Winston Churchill was defending the Soviet Union for being where it was in Poland, that it needed to be. But they were not the same when it came to Finland. And they actually gave planes and weapons to Finland to, I guess, defend against the Soviet Union. But that's a different topic. But it's definitely playing two sides here.
That is correct. As a matter of fact, when that all started, France and Britain got a plan together to basically invade what is now the city of Baku in Azerbaijan, where there was a large oil refinery and oil fields there. And they were looking to take them out and basically, as they had said, crush the Soviet monster. But by the time conditions got favorable for sending equipment over, the conflict had already been over. So they kind of had to sit back and not go through with that because it was already a done thing by that point. But yes, the French and British were ready and willing to send large amounts of military equipment to fight the Soviet Union. Yet when the war broke out with the German invasion of Poland, they actually called the French-German front at that time the phony war, because basically both sides just sat around. And in fact, had the French and British actually invaded Germany, they could have made some deep inroads into Germany and shifted the entire tide. And Hitler, in fact, I believe only had about 5 divisions and 3 panzers, while the rest had been committed into Poland. And then, of course, once Poland was done, he sent all those to Western Germany and overran Belgium and the Netherlands and Dunkirk and then France. But they could have prevented all that had they actually been serious. Well, yes, I recommend looking up the movie Mission to Moscow. It's a fantastic movie. You can find it on YouTube, and I believe also we have it on the Leninist.org website, I believe, or we've got a version. But I think also archive.org, you can find this video as well. But actually, you won't find this on YouTube because, according to YouTube, even though this was made in 1943, it was taken down due to copyright concerns. Interpret that as you will. Okay. But if there's nothing else, and I'm not seeing any new final people, we will go to our wrap-up section for tonight. So, New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn it over to Comrade New York.
Thank you. Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers, and purchasing books from New Outlook Publishers helps support the school. Of course, relevant to tonight's class, we have Unveiling the Lies of the Cold War, Ekaterina Blinova. Please check that out, as well as other great works. And once again, it's NewOutlookPublishers.store, and buying books from New Outlook Publishers helps support the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies.
Thank you, Comrade. And we will close out tonight with a rendition of the Internationale.
We watch the condescending saviors to rule us from a judgment hall. We were possessed not for their fame,